So, um, as you mentioned, Singapore has to play its own part, and I think our previous speakers have covered that we as a relatively privileged country, we have the responsibility and the capability to play our role in averting the climate crisis. Now, our next speaker, Professor Winston Chow, is going to speak on what Singapore is actually doing to resolve the climate crisis in its own capacity.
Okay, thank you. I presume you all can hear me loud and clear, I hope.
Yes.
Right.
Oh, yes.
Yes,
Great.
thanks. Thanks, Fridays for Future Singapore, for firstly organizing this event. It's a very important occasion to remind everybody that climate change, climate crisis, climate disruption is it is an existential crisis. Don't take it from me, take it from what Prime Minister Lee has said last year during his National Day rally. But the issue is, why should we care? And as my role as a sort of educator, I will just spend my 10 minutes allotted to me saying four things. First is, what does the science say? In my night job, my day job is educating, doing research in Singapore Management University. My night job instead is to work with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, trying to get their next assessment report out by 2021-2022. And we are on course to have about, I'd say, 3,000 plus pages of the latest updates and assessments on climate science. But all this can be summarized in just 10 words, borrowing from Dr. John Cook, who's currently a researcher at George Mason University and one of the finest climate communicators around. Those 10 words can sum up everything the IPCC has said. It's real, it's us, experts agree, it's bad, there's hope. Okay, I'll repeat that again. It's real, it's us, experts agree, it's bad, but there's hope. You'll come across, and I think the previous speakers have pointed out, there will be climate contrarians, climate skeptics, climate deniers, whatever you call them. They will say the opposite, which is, it's not real, it's not us, experts disagree, it's not bad, and there's no hope. That's as far away from the actual truth of climate change, climate crisis, climate disruption that we have learned over the past 30 plus years of undertaking of climate science. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, how do we actually trust climate science on those first 8 words that I just mentioned? And in my classes, I try and teach the 3 C's of climate change. First is that the evidence is coherent. It's logical, it's evidence-based, it's undergone rigorous testing since Joseph Fourier first found out about how climate change, how the atmosphere can trap in radiation. So the science is more than 200 years old, and we base our knowledge on that. The second C is that it is consilient, and this word usually is not it doesn't come across very often in the literature, but it's a beautiful term. It showcases that the different scientific disciplines of, let's say, in the Singapore context, the physics, the chemistry, and the biology all converge towards a common conclusion that if the physical science doesn't make sense to you, the chemical science makes sense to you for climate change, and the biological science also makes sense. So it's like a giant jigsaw puzzle that all the pieces from these science disciplines fit together to give you that picture of climate change. What do I mean by that? I'll give you a quick example. We know that CO2 is one of the biggest gases that causes climate change. We know that CO2, when you dissolve it in water, it becomes carbonic acid, a weak acid. We know that when this CO2 precipitates out from the atmosphere, it ends up in the oceans. So logically, you should see that, hey, the oceans should become slightly more acidic because of all that carbon that is stored inside the oceans as a carbon sink. And all the evidence, from various marine-based observational platforms or sites close to the oceans show that your ocean pH is actually dropping, is becoming more acidic. So you can see the link there between the physics and the chemistry. So that builds on our knowledge and our confidence of science. And the third C is obviously the consensus from the IPCC reports, the consensus from the scientific discipline that arises from the evidence. It is not a predetermined political consensus, but it comes from the logical and evidence-based database that we have from scientific research into climate change. So that's the second thing. We can trust what climate change says in the first 8 words of that statement that I mentioned at the beginning of this talk. But now on to the last 2 words. The third thing I wanted to say is that there's still hope. And far often than not, there's always that level of despair that can afflict people who investigate climate change, who are activists in climate change, who advocate for climate change action. But I want to point out that there is still hope, there is still time. I'm not going to say that there's a stark 10 years before we're all doomed by 2030, but that's not really the case. The case is that in our research, the IPCC, we do point out that there are policies to governments. We can't prescribe policies to governments, but we can show pathways that humanity can take as a global whole, a global commons that focus upon climate resilience, which combines climate adaptation, which combines climate mitigation and the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. This is something that governments have agreed to, and they do want us to point out, look, what are the major pathways that can be done to keep to a 1.5 or 2 degrees C world. These goals actually encompass several of the own goals that Fridays for Future have towards treating inequality, towards transitioning towards a fossil fuel-free future. There's a lot of attention towards climate justice. There's a lot of attention towards the importance of renewables. There's a lot of attention towards the importance of divestment from, like what the previous speaker said, the need to get away from fossil fuel investments in coal and in oil towards more renewable stuff. And for this last thing about hope, while science can provide information, very useful information, it can't answer everything. It only can provide information for all relevant stakeholders towards climate change to act upon. And this is where you need an additional set of C's rather than consensus, consilience, and coherence. These other sets of C's are towards action. So I will propose 3 other C's of climate action that hopefully can be taken forward by activists or climate advocates everywhere. The 4th C is communication. How do we communicate this scientific knowledge to every stakeholder, to the young and to the old, to the business community, to the governments, and so on and so forth, is critical. Translating this hope towards community action is very, very important. And that's why I think this webinar is so essential. Now on to the last thing I wanted to say, the 4th point, what can we do in Singapore? Unlike places where, shall we say, the COVID-19 response has been massively screwed up, such as the US, the UK, Brazil, and Australia, we have rather a more popular government. These 4 countries that I just mentioned, there's an unpopular government there that's also largely opposed to climate action. Thankfully, that's not really the case here in Singapore. That said, there's a limit to what we can do. We keep hearing the 0.11% of global carbon emissions that Singapore has for your scope 1 and scope 2, your direct emissions. It's also the subject of a lot of bingo cards. I know, like, oh God, the government is saying this again, and what do they mean by that? The sad thing is that you can't fight math, you can't fight the data. Even if we get to net zero, even if we remove away the 60 million tons of carbon equivalent emissions that we have by 2050 or before that, there's zero discernible influence in terms of temperature reductions around the world. Case in point, what Xi Jinping announced earlier this week, where he said we're going to commit, or China is going to commit to net zero by 2060. That reduction of 12 trillion tons, or was it 12 gigatons of CO2 rather than 50 million tons of CO2 like what Singapore has, that has a bigger impact on climate, on global temperatures in the future rather than what we can do. So you can't fight that math. However, that argument is no excuse for inaction. All right, Singapore has to act accordingly. And why is that the case? I'm going to use a few concepts that I teach in my climate change classes. You probably have heard a lot about the tragedy of the commons, how carbon pollution of a shared commons, a shared the shared atmosphere we all live and breathe in, regardless of where we live in, is not taxed. It's an externality. It's something that has to be dealt with, and that's what the science has pointed out in a lot of research. But in terms of action for reducing emissions, there's another paradox that's more important. It's a prisoner's dilemma. We have to find out that cooperation amongst individuals, cooperation amongst governments and societies in terms of doing the right thing is required for the best possible outcome, is required to keep to the world, keep the world to a 1.5 degrees C threshold limit. So in that aspect, it's not the matter of the 50 million or 60 million tons of CO2 that we can save. It's how we can show we are doing the right thing and get others on board. I have no doubt that what Xi Jinping said this week will spur a lot of other countries into action. So if we can go on board with that, get this momentum at the governmental level to showcase that, we can, by our own actions, we can influence other cities, we can influence our regional neighbors as well. What we can do apart from the ramping up of solar and ramping up of affecting the behavioral action, we can do other sorts of things. We can manage our indirect virtual carbon emissions. Yes, we do have oil and gas industry. Yes, we do have a lot of building and construction and all that. But we also import a lot of carbon from our goods and services, our materials, and the transportation of this material, which some studies have pointed out could be up to 40% of the physical carbon emissions that we generate within our territorial boundaries. We can also manage our two large carbon intensive industries better. It's not just the oil and gas industry that we've been, that is featured prominently in Jurong Island, but also a lot of the information and communication tech that is burgeoning industry in Singapore. We're going to be a data center hub, and those data centers are power hungry. And the industry itself knows that in order to be sustainable, there has to be better ways of being more efficient, as well as to reduce that industrial carbon footprint as best as they can. The third thing is that businesses have to go to net zero. The sustainability argument has to also include what large and small corporates have to are doing in terms of their direct and indirect emissions. In terms of what the local, what Singapore's doing, I need to mention what Temasek Holdings has done. They're trying to get to net zero and trying to get in terms of both their direct operations and in their investment portfolios. But there are other things that can be prompted or can be done. Talking to industries to say, look, you need to divest. What's the point in investing in sunset industries like coal with stranded assets when your return of investment is negative, even with whatever governmental subsidies? There has to be standards, high environmental standards in operations. It's not in my discussions and engagements with the corporate world, the challenge is telling them, look, it's not so much an environmental sustainability argument, it's an economic sustainability argument. If you don't improve your practices, both your strategic and your operational practices, your competitors will, and you're going to lose your lunch. And that's the way of using the profit motive to persuade corporations to actually change their behavior towards a more sustainable end. I will conclude by pointing out that the third C that matters is cooperation. So the 3 C's of climate action: communication, building a community, and cooperation within the community. That's what matters in trying to get this climate crisis to something, or resolve this climate crisis in the years to come. Okay, that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Right. So we'll be filling some questions for you. So you mentioned that the Singaporean government does, to an extent, consult the experts. I mean, they've already invested a lot in researching the impacts of climate change, how it will affect Singapore. Obviously, they're also spending 100 billion to build defenses against rising sea levels, if I'm correct. Is that?
That's for the adaptation part.
Right.
When they're looking at how to resolve the issue of rising sea levels. But yeah, and it's probably going to be more than 100 billion, but that's besides the point.
All right. So the one thing we sort of noticed is this. There's a lot of rhetoric about how Singapore is sort of doing well and is a regional, if not global, climate leader. I mean, it's not. This isn't coming from me. It's coming from you can Google it. PM, yeah, right. But specifically, PM Lee said at a summit last year, a climate action summit last year, that Singapore is doing its fair share with regards to both adaptation and mitigation. I don't know. Do you think that's true? Do they have this sort of merit to the claim?
It's a relative argument. That's what I think. The bar is set low, admittedly, because when the Paris Agreement in 2015 was drawn up, it's bottom up. They didn't want to make the error that the Kyoto Agreement had, where all the decisions in terms of your emissions was top down. So each nation state was free to come up with what would be considered reasonable, or reasonable in terms of its action. But one thing about Paris is that your nationally determined contributions, the amount of CO2 emitted within your geographical boundaries, you are expected to ramp it up over time. The closer you get to 2030, the closer you get to 2050. So what I'll do an Obi-Wan Kenobi and say that what PM Lee said is probably true from his, or from a certain point of view, but the point is that compared to other nations, I guess the geopolitics is that they want to see how the large emitters, the Chinas, the Indias, the US and the EU, what will they do in terms of ramping up their own respective NDCs in the future, whether or not their own mitigation actions can improve upon what they suggested they can do during the time from Paris and subsequent conference of parties. So yes, maybe they think maybe Singapore is doing more than its fair share, but there is way more room for growth, and the time in terms of urgency is getting shorter and shorter. And given recent announcements, my hope is that the sort of bold declaration that Senior Minister Teo Chee Hean said earlier this year, that they would aim for net zero sometime soon after 2050, can be actually pulled forward. So it's up to them. We know that the government, in terms of its ethos, is to do something along the lines of under promise and over deliver. My hope, and without saying too much, my expressed hope is that they will keep to this over delivering and try and pull forward this horizon of net zero before the 2050 time limit that I think everybody around the world is hoping that will come to pass.
Right. So, so on that topic, you say that the Singaporean government is sort of looking for signals from other countries with regard, with basically the bigger polluters such as China, India, and the US. But my question then is, China, as you know, has recently committed to carbon neutral by 2060, correct?
Carbon neutral by 2060, yes.
Right. In the US, if I remember correctly, there were projections that if Biden wins the presidency, the US will go carbon neutral by like 2035. And if Trump wins 2050,
let's not talk about Trump winning. It's very depressing.
Oh, okay. Yes. We'll see how that goes.
Yes, fingers crossed. We worry about things that we can control. I guess
Yeah.
if
So
the issue is wait, so what's the question? Is the question whether or not it matters in the long run,
I
or
mean, yeah, that's the thing. Like we should be worrying about things that we can control.
yes, yes.
Yeah. So in that regard, I don't, I don't know. Would it be? Should we still say that Singapore should be taking the lead, like setting more ambitious
Yes,
goals?
yes. Undoubtedly, yes. Singapore should be more ambitious. It's not. It's while we wear different hats. If Singapore is a unique, an oddity in the sense that it can both be a city and a state at the same time. The thing that I would like to stress is that there's an opportunity for Singapore to take the lead, and we like to think of ourselves as punching above our weight. If the opportunity arises to showcase that, look, as a city, we are, in a unique environment. We are one of 2 or 3 major cities in the equatorial belt, which is we don't have tropical cyclones, we don't have major droughts or things like that afflict a lot of our neighbors or elsewhere. So we're rather fortunate to have that. But it's also this stability also allows us the chance to develop potential industries, potential solutions, but potential practices that can be implemented in other larger cities that are rapidly expanding around the world. There is hope for that, and if not just for the governmental aspect, but also for the private sector. I don't see why businesses here can take a stand in promoting, promoting ESG stuff, promoting sustainability stuff, promoting divestment in the future, and also the sort of applied solutions, your traffic management, the sort of ERP technology that has been exported elsewhere, the fact that we are going to remove all internal combustion engine transportation, private ICE engines by 2040, which is ahead of what the IPCC recommends is one of its pathways, which is the 2050 deadline. There are things that the management of these solutions, I hate to use the term uniquely Singapore, but there is a sort of way that Singapore does these sort of things that can provide good case studies for other cities elsewhere to learn and to apply. That's one of the things that I've been quite forthright in my commentaries and in my discussions with the powers that be, both in the public sector and in the private sector, in terms of focusing on these ideas as sort of ways to implement, to keep your revenues up, and also to become more sustainable and deal with the climate crisis worldwide.
So thank you for that. I think like we all know that Singapore's goals aren't exactly that high, and I think the climate action tracker says that if we continue with our with what we are doing right now, I think we're on track to a world that's like 3 to 4 degrees Celsius higher. So what concrete policies do you think the government can do to let us like be able to hit that 2 degrees goals? Do you think can you think of any concrete policies that we should start doing soon?
Okay. A few come to mind. First, there's no silver bullet. Like what other speakers before me have said, you can't just have one bullet and think that it'll solve everything. A range of policies have to be put into place. That's on us. First is target the big industries that are the major carbon polluters. We have to move away from natural gas sooner rather than later. I think the plan is there. The sort of stimulation towards investments in R&D are needed. There is potential for CCUS, carbon capture, utilization, and storage. Hopefully that comes to pass sooner rather than later. I mean, the research is there. The challenges are in upscaling that to something that is profitable, sustainable in terms of profitability for the industry. Second is that renewables in terms of solar have to be put into place as soon as possible. There is a solar plan. It's more concrete than the East Coast plan, for one thing. What can be done is that you need to have a large chunk of energy supply directed to renewables from solar. And in terms of our geographical location, I think with the zero tide and zero wind influence towards renewables, and zero hydro and zero geothermal. Solar is probably the only way to go. It's also that technology, which I think previous speakers have pointed out, the cost per unit of electricity provided is plummeting, and it has the most potential. There's also hope that we can import in energy from a regional power grid that is primarily driven by renewables, either hydro or from solar elsewhere, or they get in the private sort of investment from Australia. There was that idea mooted that a solar farm in the northern territories of Australia could export energy to Singapore. So if you can replace the 90% of energy generated by natural gas today with a combination of local and regional sort of renewables, that would be a massive start. And I think the policy towards that end is also in play. A lot of my students, when I teach climate change, they mention nuclear. I am at this point still agnostic. There's still a lot of risk with nuclear in play, and I think the government has articulated that well. That's probably a discussion for another day, whether or not nuclear is something useful for Singapore. Then what else? Don't focus so much on the behavioral sort of solutions. We, over the past 9 months, has it been? Yeah, about 9 months since COVID took effect. Emissions worldwide have dropped compared to last year by anywhere from 6 to 7%, even after the reawakening of industrial emissions worldwide, mostly from China. We are on course to have somewhat of a 4 or 5% reduction compared to last year. All this reduction is primarily driven by individual or collective individual action in not taking business trips or tourist trips elsewhere. It's the aviation and maritime sectors have taken a large hit. Emissions from there have dropped substantially. The individual action can't get you to the 1.5 or 2 degrees C world as much as structural solutions, policies that target the major emitters in the industry, in power generation, in agriculture, in the building and construction industry. And that's where the biggest potential for actually doing something can be done. And in Singapore's case, the building and construction industry, there's evidence that more sustainable practices for design, for construction, moving towards low emission, high efficiency, low emission construction practices and maintenance is in play. Okay, hello, anyone there?
Hello.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah,
okay, good. We're still here. Good to see that.
I think I'm quite surprised to hear that there's actually a plan to move away from natural gases, because I think the rhetoric that we've been told all the time is that
not told.
yeah, I think right. Yeah, so actually I think among the 10 words you said just now, ending with there's hope. I think what you shared today really shows that there is a lot of hope. I think a lot of us came into this movement, like activism, thinking that wow, there's so much things to do and like nobody's listening to us. But I think your sharing has like given us like, I guess, a roadmap on how and what Singapore can do. And I guess I guess there really is hope, and there's things that we can do.
Good to hear that. I hope that, again, on the theme of hope, I'll be honest. I always, when I teach climate change, I always end up in the final, and in case some of my students are hearing, I always end my final lecture by answering the question, are we effed? And it has changed over time. When I first started teaching, I was very, sort of depressed and realized that, there's not much hope. But in recent times, because of the role of activists and the role of and in my own role when I go for the various IPCC meetings with my fellow authors and also with governmental delegates, the sort of words and actions that have taken place by youths worldwide, by people in the corporate world who realize and they listen to what you have to say, is quite significant. So it's not an issue of we're doomed or we're effed or climate doomers, so on and so forth. But I think that the tide is turning, and it has been rather sustained since 2018, when the SR, the special report for 1.5 came out from the IPCC, and that spurred a lot of action and discussion. So what you guys do actually do make a difference. And I view my role as an educator and as a concerned parent is that making sure that the rhetoric is not empty, that is actually grounded in good science and good social science and good policy. And yeah, so so as I say, if my students are listening, the answer is already there. We're not screwed just yet. There's still hope. And yeah, that's all I have to say. Thanks.
Thank you so much for the sharing.